This is not a moment when you can have any idea what's really going on in the world if you only know about AI. This is a time to read Tolstoy and understand technology.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're very privileged to be joined today by Marianne Williamson, an American author, speaker, and politician, best known as a former presidential candidate for the United States, a New York Times bestseller, Return to Love, and as Oprah Winfrey's spiritual advisor. So please join me in welcoming Marianne.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a lot of fun to be here in this interface of this esteemed historic institution with the fact that you are people living in 2024. And I'm sure that is an interesting process for all of you, aligning the meaning of your lives at this point in history with that which is handed down to you practically from the ages. One of the reasons I'm always happy to speak to college students particularly is because you're not 20th century people. You weren't even born there, a lot of you. And those of you who were born there just sort of hung out there while you were learning to walk, hung out there as children for a while. The mindset of the 21st century is very different than the mindset of the 20th, much like the mindset of the 20th was different than the 19th. And the mindset of the 20th century was very mechanistic, very rationalistic. The world was one big machine, the legacy of Newtonian physics. If you don't like what's happening in the world, you just tweak the pieces of the machine. But this, of course, is the 21st century. Famously, a British physicist named James Jeans said it turns out the world, in fact, is not one big machine, it's one big thought. So whereas those who were born and lived most of their lives in the 20th century are experiencing the tumult of this time, much like where the Atlantic meets the Pacific, these are two paradigms, as it were, that do not easily align always. The 21st century is much more holistic, much more whole person. If you are stuck in a mechanistic perspective, then by definition, you are more attuned to the externals, to the level of symptoms. Whereas if you are taking a more holistic and a whole person perspective, you realize that you have to address root causes as well as symptoms if you're going to fundamentally change the world. And you also are open to the fact that many of those root causes are internal dynamics and internal changes that need to occur. Now, my own personal story is that when I was in college in the United States, we're talking about, I graduated from high school in 1970, so I was very much politically active in my high school years and then early years of the 1970s. So when I was in college, you read Ram Dass and Alan Watts in the morning, and then you went to a Vietnam anti-war protest in the afternoon. There wasn't this issue of categorization, stay in your lane. It was a time of profound cultural change, sexual change, musical change, spiritual change. It was a larger countercultural revolution that pretty much involved everything. You weren't asked to choose. You weren't asked to choose, and that the fact that everything became so categorized, I think, is very limiting for us now. This is not a moment when you can have any idea what's really going on in the world if you only know about AI. This is a time to read Tolstoy and understand technology. This is a moment to read Thucydides and to also understand what's happening in the latest in technology. And we'll talk more about that. The fact that this is a moment where the generalist, the mindset of the generalist is extremely important, because if you stay in only one lane, you're not getting the whole picture. And you can't feel comfortable within yourself there, because human beings are multidimensional. So the world is by definition multidimensional. Now, when I was growing up, I never felt that I had to decide between the Alan Watts in the morning and the political anti-war protests in the afternoon. You tried to destroy the US war machine, and you tried to understand Lao Tzu. There wasn't like either or. I felt in my personal life, the way my life unfolded, I felt that my whatever talents and skills and propensity was true for me would have to do with personal, spiritual, metaphysical transformation. It wasn't like I didn't care about politics. It was just that I thought, I was living at a time where, just vote for the Democrat and be a liberal. It'll be okay, more than not. Seems like a long time ago, to be honest. And early in my career, I began to work right when I began giving lectures on universal spiritual themes, metaphysics. The AIDS crisis blew up in Los Angeles, where I was living at the time. So in my career, deep human suffering was right in front of me from the beginning, that this was no joke. This was life and death here. This is human beings who are going through the worst things that can happen. And from that, actually, a great privilege occurred in my life. The joke was, nobody calls Marianne because things are going well. I have had the honor of being with people in some of their darkest hours. I was the person, I was there when the call just came in, the test results were not good. Someone you love suddenly died. Your child is addicted to crystal meth and you didn't even know they had a drug problem. These are the kinds of things I saw. But when my career began in the 1980s, what was true in who I encountered in my life, as well as in America as I knew it, was that the time of crisis was the exception and not the rule. Towards the end of the 1990s, beginning of 2000, I began to see something has really changed in this country, because I began to see more and more people for whom the state of crisis was the rule and not the exception. The problem wasn't just that they had cancer, the problem was that they don't have health insurance. The problem was not just looking for a job, the problem was the fact that they couldn't even live on just one or two or three. And because I became successful as an author, mainly due to Oprah Winfrey, and those of you who are young might not remember the awesome power that she had at that time. The issue became that I would meet politicians, and I thought I was involved. I would vote, I would hold fundraisers, I would give, and I would say to politicians, and they would be Democratic usually because that was my party, I would say, well, you really guys, you really need to do something about healthcare. I mean, it's just awful. And then a few years later, I meet the same politician. Guys, it's really bad out there. People are really suffering. Yeah, we're really trying. Just make sure we get reelected. Said a few times longer, Marianne, you could probably really help just raise more money so we could get elected. And it began to dawn on me, you guys aren't going to do anything. You guys aren't going to fundamentally change anything, are you? This is all a game, isn't it? And that was when I decided to run for office. What happened for me in running for office is that, and I will just wrap it up with this, and then we can take the conversation wherever you like. There has been in the United States now, those of you who are from Great Britain, you probably are aware that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were great friends. So that makes all the sense in the world. So I don't know if that had a devastating effect on this country, but it sure as heck had a devastating effect on mine. Not their partnership, but Reagan's philosophy. And there has basically been, over the last 50 years, a corporate coup in the United States. And whereas Abraham Lincoln stood on the battlefield at Gettysburg, Gettysburg being the decisive battle in the Civil War, after which it was clear that the Union would in fact win. He said that the men who had died there had given what he called their last full measure of devotion so that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. It is perishing now. It is perishing on our watch. It is now a government of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. Short-term profit maximization by huge behemoth corporate entities now have replaced humanitarian and democratic principles as America's functional bottom line. So whereas in 1776, in the United States, we repudiated the overlords, the landed gentry, and the aristocracy and the kings of England. Well, we've just regressed and basically manifest the newest version of that. Today, it's not lords and ladies and kings. It's insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies, big food companies, big oil companies, big chemical companies, big agricultural companies, and defense contractors. And they are corporate overlords. And their short-term profits, in the most, ever since Reagan particularly, they're unfettered. I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, you will correct me if I'm wrong, I think, didn't Thatcher say something like there is no public sector?
No society.
Pardon?
But there's such thing as society.
Yeah, the public, yeah. So whereas the tradition in the United States was that the government would be the broker between individual liberty, which included, of course, economic liberty, and a concern for the common good, there has been a $50 trillion transfer of wealth, we should call it what it is, theft, from the bottom 90% of Americans. And at this point, I'm sorry to have to tell you, the political parties more than not chop wood and carry water for these corporate overlords, who are their donor class. I thought before I ran for office that they chopped wood and carried water for the corporate overlords, but I realize now they are corporate overlords. And this is a form of economic tyranny. We are at a point in the United States where 39% of Americans say that they regularly skip meals in order to pay their rent. Millions of people are selling their blood plasma. We have, as you know, we have no universal health insurance, which is granted to the citizens not only of every other advanced democracy, but every other advanced nation. We have 1 in 4 Americans living with medical debt. We have 75 to 90 million people who are underinsured or uninsured. So you have millions of people in the United States whose insurance will cover their trip to the doctor, but it won't cover the tests they need. It won't cover the insurance. Here in this country, you don't have anybody, or any of the countries I assume that you come from, unless you're American, in your countries, I doubt that there are people putting GoFundMe pages up on the internet in order to fund life-saving operations for themselves and their children. 18 million Americans cannot pay for the prescriptions that their doctors give them. We have 1.3 million who ration their insulin. The fact that you even can be here at Oxford, we don't have any kind of tuition-free college or tech school in the United States. We have tens of millions of people burdened by these college loan debts. I can't even imagine being in my 20s, carrying tens of thousands of dollars worth of college loan. And at this point, it is baked into the economic cake in the United States that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Out of this has emerged profound political dysfunction. After World War I, in this case, actually, it was an American president who stood for the right thing, not that he stood for the right thing on a lot of other issues. His name was Woodrow Wilson. But basically, the Allies after World War I made reparations from Germany, Deutschmark, till we tell you to stop. Anytime you have large groups of desperate people, this becomes a national security risk, sometimes an international security risk, because large groups of desperate people become a petri dish out of which all manner personal and societal dysfunction is almost inevitable, and that often includes vulnerability to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. So now we have a real problem on our hands in the United States. This election, and you will tell me how much you want to talk about any element of that. We have a situation now which is a symptom of profound dysfunction. You cannot have a thriving democracy where you do not have a thriving middle class. And I'd like to end with this story. When I was in college, I don't know if they do that now, if you do this now, but in those days, long ago, I'm old enough now, you know, that I can say long ago, I remember when, we used to have art posters on our dorm rooms. And I had all these art posters that were by a Scottish painter named Edward Burne-Jones. And they were these huge angels. And I didn't know anything about him. I didn't know anything about these. I just thought these angels were so beautiful. Years later, I was writing a book called Healing the Soul of America. I was interested in the intersection of spirituality and politics. that was when I read so much Gandhi. I read about King. I read about the articulation of nonviolence as a political philosophy by Gandhi. Dr. King went to India, studied those principles, brought them back to the application, for application to the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s. I realized we don't have any wheels that we have to reinvent here. And I realized then, and I realize now, that this is the only hope for what's happening, not just in my country, but in your country too, no matter where you come from. We're living at a time of chaos and tumult that reason alone cannot handle. This has to do now with an evolution of the species. It has to do with a movement forward in who we are as people. Nothing else will do. So years after I was in college, I'm walking up Fifth Avenue in New York City, and I passed the Metropolitan Museum. And at the Met, when they have an exhibit of painters or sculptors or whatever, they have these huge flags in front of the museum. And I saw those big angels. Edward Burne-Jones. I thought, oh, this is so cool, because I don't know anything about him, and I love those pictures. They have them here. And you know, now when you go into museums and they have these little machines and you can listen, and that sort of gives you a little biographical information. At that time, I was already writing my book about the intersection of spirituality, politics, reading about Gandhi, reading about the Industrial Revolution in England, then in the United States, which was really the climax of this understanding of industrialization, Western science, Western materialism, etc. There were philosophers and artists, both on this side of the pond and in the United States. And in my country, it was Emerson, it was Thoreau, it was Walt Whitman, and so forth, who were saying, terrible things are going to happen from this. You're being lured into only looking outside. You're going to be so obsessed with things. And those things, of course, became money. And everything's a commodity. And everything's about the outside. And you're going to forget about the things that matter most. You're going to forget about ethics. You're going to forget about love. You're going to forget about real deep human connection. You're going to forget about reverence for each other, for yourselves, for animals, for the earth. And what I heard when I heard about Edward Burne-Jones was he was one of them. And his line was, every time they build a machine, I will paint an angel. So I think that's really the bottom line for me. We need to find the angels within ourselves. When Lincoln said the angels of our better nature, this was before Freud was born. So when people talked about angels and demons, they weren't as unsophisticated as we thought. They were talking about the life of the psyche. Love is an angel and hate is a demon. And we better find our angels, and we better find them pretty quickly, or God help us all.